For today's show, we have something a little different. We are actually releasing an episode of a new podcast by our friends over at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. This is hosted by Dr. Joshua Berman. You will recognize his name. You've heard his voice many times on this podcast. He's an expert in Hebrew Bible, and he is interviewing scholars going through the Torah, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3. This is the very first episode of their podcast, and so we're releasing this episode and encouraging you to go subscribe to their podcast, The Bible Bar, wherever you find podcasts. Don't forget, you can like and subscribe to this show if you like and subscribe to it. Or you can also give to us at hebraicthought.org/give. That's thebiblicalmind.org/give.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
From Bar-Ilan University in Israel, home to the world's largest program in Hebrew Bible, I'm your host, Joshua Berman, and this is The Bible Bar, where each week I have a great conversation with colleagues of mine at Bar-Ilan and around the world about another chapter in Scripture. So come on into the bar, and thanks for joining us. Genesis 1, the account of creation. But this account of creation that we find at the beginning of the Torah seems to have some things in common with other creation myths and stories from across the ancient Near East. What are we to make of that? Well, let's help us sort all this out. I have with me today in the inaugural episode of the Bible Bar, the eminent Assyriologist and Old Testament scholar, Lawson Younger, Emeritus Professor of Old Testament and Semitic Languages. Welcome, Lawson, to the Bible Bar.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Appreciate it.
So just before we get started, Lawson, on Genesis 1, I want to share with our listeners an anecdote that I recall with great fondness from our first meeting some years ago. We were together at a conference at the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center in Houston, and it was a weekend conference about the Exodus. And being a weekend conference, that meant for me that it was over Shabbat, with all the Shabbat observance entails. And the Lanier Center was very good about organizing to get me kosher food, all wrapped up the way kosher food usually comes into such events. And I recall that Friday night, there was a big banquet, maybe 150 people. And as I took my place at the table, I took out my little bottle of kosher wine, which I had brought with me from Israel. Right. And as I began to pour it to recite the Kiddush, the sanctification of the Shabbat, that we say on Friday night just at the beginning of the meal, I guess that caught your eye. You came on over to me and you said to me, Josh, would you be willing to make Kiddush for all of us here and chant it out loud? And so I did just that. I recited the Kiddush for everybody, which was then followed by grace. And it led me to feel that this moment was a moment of Kiddush with grace in every meaning of the word. All right, so let's dive into it. So before we get to comparisons between the Old Testament and what we find elsewhere in the ancient Near East, just give us a little bit of an orientation about the types of materials that we're finding that go under the general rubric of creation stories. If I understand, we have accounts of creation of the world and accounts of creation of the gods. So maybe just tell us a little bit briefly about those materials, and then we'll get to the comparisons.
Happy to do so. Really, what we have are what are typically called cosmogonies. These are creation accounts of how the world came into being, and theogonies, which are creation accounts of the deities, how they came into being. The fact of the matter is that in the ancient Near East, whether we're in Mesopotamia or Egypt, and those are the locations where we have the bulk of such materials, these really combine. So the cosmogonies of Mesopotamia are, in fact, theogonies. They not only tell about the creation of the universe, the cosmos, but they also tell the story of the creation of the gods, and the same thing in Egypt. The reason for this is that ancient Near Eastern peoples were what the famous Egyptologist Jan Osman called, they were cosmic theistic people. That is, they saw the stuff of creation, the material of creation, and the deities all intertwined. They were one. So when you looked at the sun, you were looking at a deity. If you looked at the moon, you're looking at a deity, a mountain, a river, all these things. And in certain ways, a way of envisioning this would be to think in very simple animistic terms, in which each of these things that we encounter in the universe are agents within themselves, they're deities within themselves. Genesis 1 is very different than that. The stuff of creation is created by God and is not part of God.
Since I don't believe that Genesis 1 is giving us a full scientific account of the creation of the universe and of the world, it's not answering a scientific question. What question is it answering?
I agree with you. I don't think it's meant to be a scientific account.
Mm-hmm.
The very imposition of structure as is there that culminates in the Shabbat, though the word Shabbat doesn't actually occur as the noun in that passage, but the structure is clearly designed to reinforce that notion. It's telling the who of creation, not the how of creation.
Hi there, Biblical Mind listeners and viewers. I wanted to give a quick advertisement about a conference that we're putting on. It's in Philadelphia, March 24th and 25th. We're partnering up with the American Bible Society, and we're doing this. It's called the Bible First, and the topic here this time is politics. It won't always be politics, but these Bible First conferences, we're inviting speakers in to come help us in this one. Think about the question, politics and religion go great together, but how do they go well together? Okay, so we're going to bring in fantastic speakers, Anthony Bradley, Chris Green, Dale Coulter, James Wood, Kirsten Berghag, Matthew Taylor, Miles Smith the third or the fourth, and Miroslav Volf. That's right, we have all of those people speaking. This is for pastors and lay leaders. Anybody's interested in figuring out how to speak appropriately from Scripture, from various perspectives, about how politics and religion go together. All right. We hope you can sign up. It's actually free to attend. You get a free lunch with it as well, thanks to the American Bible Society. But if you sign up, we need you to show up. It's in Philadelphia, March 24th, 25th. Go to BibleFirst.org to register.
That's really interesting, the who, because that leads me to the next question that I was going to ask. You know, I'm a devout Jew, you're a devout Christian. We both come from traditions that have catechisms that open with both, just basic things that one needs to know about the essence of God. And Genesis 1 opens up and doesn't tell us anything about God, whether is he corporeal or not, is he one or not, is he, was he always here? Not nothing. It just blasts right in. So that really strikes me as remarkable when we think about, the catechisms that we have. So why doesn't Genesis tell us anything about God? Or is it telling us something about God?
Well, I think it is telling us something about God, a very important thing, and that is that he is creator. And that is no small matter. As creator, he has authority over us. And I think Jews and Christians have always recognized that as creator, he is king of the universe, he is the sovereign, and therefore we are called to serve him with our lives. So I think it does. I think Genesis 1:3 gives us information about God insofar as it tells us that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Notice he's not down in the waters. He's not part of the waters. He's separate from the waters, but he's very much in detail doing what is necessary to create the universe.
As you mentioned, I've never really thought about that phrase. What it says, obviously, in the Hebrew, which you're obviously familiar with, is that it was the Ruach Elohim.
Right.
And that word Elohim is God. Ruach Well, it can be spirit, but I think that mostly in the Old Testament it means wind.
Yes, it certainly can mean
Because when
that.
you say spirit,
But
I mean that has certain connotations in our modern spiritual parlance.
yes,
So what does it mean that the ruach, the wind slash spirit of God?
one of the things about not only the Bible, but other ancient texts, sometimes we're confronted with challenges in terms of what exactly were they thinking and meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think the notion, as I see it, is it's speaking to the fact that God is invisible and is not
That's
a
so interesting.
physical being
Wow,
like we encounter throughout the rest of the text. I think that the Genesis 1 goes out of its way
that's
to
so
stress
interesting.
the
Wow,
difference.
that it's not the hand of God even. This
No,
that
it's not
you're
even the
saying it's
hand of God.
wow. That's so
So it's not an
interesting. Wow,
anthropomorphism. It
wow.
is, I think, a very important statement and one that I think needs to be stressed as we look at Genesis 1. But I think Genesis 1 goes out of its way to stress the difference between God the Creator and the stuff of creation, the material of creation.
Mm.
So much so that I would say years and years ago, my family, like I'm sure your family and others, have read the Bible together and we're reading Genesis 1. In fact, the children at that time were learning to read and they asked, can we read Genesis 1? And we would take turns reading a verse.
Mm-hmm.
And we read in Genesis that God created the greater and lesser lights. And my daughter said, what does that mean? And I said, well, it means the sun and the moon. And she said, yes, but why does he say the greater and lesser lights? Why did you say the sun and the moon?
Mm-hmm.
And it hit me like a ton of bricks for the first time that if
It's
he
good we
had
have
used
children. Yeah.
if he had used the Hebrew word shemesh, that could be confused for God creating
Oh
a
my gosh.
deity in
Oh my
Canaanite
gosh.
cult,
Wow.
Shemesh. And if he had said
Wow.
Yahreach, that would be the equivalent of Yahrik in the Canaanite, and
Mm-hmm.
there could be confusion. There's no confusion. We know exactly the entities that he's talking about, but he
Mm.
doesn't use those words. Therefore, I cannot conclude that God created lesser gods from Genesis 1.
Wow. Wow. So this attempt to really separate out the very physical corporal world from an
Yes.
incorporeal God, that's really it's fascinating to me when I think of Genesis 2, where it
Mm,
describes the creation of man, vayitzer, which means to kind of fashion as a potter does. So even
yes.
though it doesn't speak about God's hands and the clay on his hands or anything like that, but that's already a move towards using a metaphor that's
Yes.
a little more corporeal. So I guess
Mhm.
this might explain then also why the act of creation, it isn't just that God created or God made, those are verbs that
Mhm.
we have, but that
Right.
it's done explicitly by the least physical act possible, which is speech.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. The spoken
Okay.
word is a clear indication that God, the true and living God, can accomplish things by simply speaking. His power is that great.
So we've spoken here quite a bit about the Almighty. Let's talk about humanity. Humanity in the creation, cosmogonies and theogonies that you mentioned before, and man here in Genesis 1. So take it away.
Oh, well, I mean, of course, God tells us something very, or the narrative tells us something very special that God said, let us make human beings in our image and likeness, and then goes on to describe the creation of male and female. And human beings then are very special because they are made in God's image. Now, that has been a point of debate by theologians of all sorts for centuries. I can't unpack all of that, but
Mm-hmm.
at the very minimum, I think it must indicate that there are capacities within human beings that are likened to God so that we can have a relationship with Him, and that there's an intention on His part for us to be able over against other creatures to have a spiritual capacity to interact with the true and living God.
And what happens in the ancient Near Eastern materials? What place does man play in those? I mean, obviously, the ones that are talking about creating the gods, not a whole lot. But some of them, I'm thinking of Atrahasis and some other. Yeah. So where does man come out there?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, both in Mesopotamian cosmogonies and Egyptian cosmogonies, humans are created to replace the lesser gods. They are to be servant slaves, providing food and sustenance for the great gods. And so we see this whether it's in Enuma Elish or Atrahasis. We also see it in the abundance of various different Egyptian cosmogonies as well. But there's another thing that is interesting about the ancient Near Eastern accounts, if I may bring it up, and that is they see some aspect of divinity in the creation, humans. Whether this is in Egypt through the tears of the god or through other mechanisms, there is in some way, just like all the other stuff of creation, human beings have some part of divinity within them. Again, it's this animistic thought world that is, I believe, not represented in the Bible.
So what you said that in the Mesopotamian materials, we find that humanity replaces the lower gods as servants to the higher gods. So that really is a 180-degree turn when we get to Genesis 1, where God says, well, I'm giving you the world and to dominate, rule over it, etc.
That's right. Yes. In fact, I think the picture there is really has a very clear rulership aspect to it. If you like, instead of slaves, we are lesser kings and queens who are to administer the complex universe that God has, to have dominion.
Psalm 8 has a lot of
Psalm
that.
8, yes, absolutely.
All right, so we have all these stark differences, but there are also some similarities between the accounts, particularly in just what seems to be the incorporation, borrowing, polemicizing through slight details I have in mind, and you can tell me a little bit more about them. The deep, we have Tiamat in Mesopotamian literature and the Hebrew word Tehom. We can talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, so tell me about what's Tiamat in Mesopotamian creation materials and the Hebrew word Tehom. Those at home can hear already, even without knowing these languages, that they are somehow related. So go ahead.
That's right. The Mesopotamian account where Tiamat occurs is in Enuma Elish in particular. And the name Tiamat goes back to a Proto-Semitic root that is the same as Tehom in Hebrew. So there's no doubt that there is a clear etymological link between the two. Though the semantic meaning of Tehom with the notion of deep is really more semantically similar to Apsu in Akkadian that has the notion of the deep. So while they are etymologically related in a very far back period of the Semitic languages, they really don't have the exact same notion.
I see. So you don't see in this particular instance of Tiamat in Mesopotamia and Tehom in the Old Testament direct borrowing, direct polemicizing. No, just they have philological ancestors.
They do have a definite etymological ancestor.
Etymological.
If I might quote someone,
wow,
the Japanese scholar David Sumura did a wonderful job of investigating this years ago. And I'm just going to read two sentences, his conclusion. This etymological investigation shows that the formal similarities are no proof of direct or indirect borrowing.
Very interesting. Wow.
In other words, the fact that the Hebrew term Tehom shares a common Proto-Semitic origin with the Akkadian divine name Tiamat and the Ugaritic Tahamu, does not support the theory that the Hebrew term is a depersonification of an original divine
Mm.
name.
Mm.
And I would concur with that. I think his study shows that to be clearly the case. So while
Mhm.
there is a similarity, there's no ifs, ands, and buts, but etymological ties does not mean that they are necessarily denoting the same thing in the two different languages.
Okay, what about the notion that humans are created in the image of God? I think that has echoes, or we see similar things in these ancient Near Eastern materials. Is that how would you characterize the relationship there?
Again, as I was saying, I think the Bible really stresses the uniqueness in that human beings in the Mesopotamian and Egyptian view are the basis upon which deities are envisioned. In other words, deities are anthropomorphic,
Right.
envisioned, and statues are made of them
Right.
in the ancient Near East because it's, in a sense, the reverse of what we're seeing in Genesis 1, 26 and following. And I would also stress the fact that it's Selim and Demut that are stressed in
Yeah, in other words,
Genesis.
let's just translate those. So there's actually two terms
Right,
that we find in Genesis 1 for image of God.
right. And they both have similar connotations, though different. But there is, I think, a very interesting statue that was discovered, an Aramaic Akkadian cuneiform bilingual that was found at Tel Fakharea in
Yeah.
Syria. And this dates about, roughly about 840 BCE,
Okay.
and is the Aramaic is one of the earliest Old Aramaic inscriptions that we have. But in that inscription, it uses the term psalm and demut as descriptors for the king who is envisioned on the statue.
So you said that we have this Aramaic inscription that has the basic roots of Tselem and Dmut,
Right.
which we routinely translate together both as image.
Image and
And then,
likeness or something.
yeah, right.
These both occur in that inscription and are used to describe the statue of the king who
Mm-hmm.
is represented,
Mm-hmm.
which I think shows us in a very real sense. This goes back to what I was trying to say with reference to the fact that human beings are, in a sense, little kings or vassal kings of the great king. And the very combination of these terms would, in my opinion, lead one additionally to this conclusion. So this is, I think, part and parcel of how, again, there is both similarity in the vocabulary and in some particular notions, but at the same time, there is a subtle difference between them.
Some will say that the closest parallel that we have to Genesis 1 in the ancient creation materials is from Egypt, and is what is known as the Memphite theology.
Yes.
And it would date from, if I'm not mistaken, the 14th century BCE, which many would say, or at least we don't know
It's
when it
New
began. New
I
Kingdom,
think
yeah.
most would say it's 19th dynasty now.
Okay. Which also many people would say is would fit a time frame in which there might have been an Israelite presence in Egypt at that time. And from what I know about that particular version of creation, it speaks about how the Egyptian god Ptah, god of wisdom, brings into existence many things through utterances, through speaking. Kind of in a serial way. It doesn't speak of days, but it certainly is stages, one thing after another. And it's at its conclusion, it says that Ptah was very satisfied with his work, just as it says on the sixth day of creation. I mean, on
Yes.
every day it says, and it was good, and on the sixth day it was very good.
Right.
I mean, those similarities, the utterances, and especially the
Yes.
reflection at the end of the process that it was
Right.
satisfying, that it was very good, are unmistakable. I mean, there is also, from what I understand, the enormous difference that what Ptah is creating is idols and temples to house the spirits of the gods, of the gods, as to what
Well,
you were speaking before, their
right.
manifestation here in this
It's,
world. So that it's really, in that regard, completely different than Genesis 1, which is all about creating a nice cradle and playpen for man, and there it's for the gods. But when you see these elements that are so similar, the utterances and the reflection that the creation was all very good, it's hard to maintain that this kind of arose in a sui generis way, spontaneously in Egypt and for Israelites. What do you make of that connection
yeah,
there?
no, I think there's every likelihood that the writer of Genesis 1 has some familiarity with the Memphite theology as well as in other with other Egyptian cosmogonies. I
Hmm.
think he probably also has a knowledge of the Mesopotamian accounts. Though, I mean, Enuma Elish may actually be a little bit problematic depending on when exactly you were to think the writer of Genesis is working. But in any event, I think that would definitely explain because Ptah is, in a sense, here usurping the role of Atum in the earlier cosmogonies in Egypt. There is something political happening here.
Just to unpack that for us a little bit,
Yeah,
what was the role of Atum earlier, and what is Ptah taking over here? Yeah.
Atum was the first deity in which all things, both gods and material universe, were contained. He is the one from which the many come.
Hmm.
To use Horning's phraseology. So, in a very real sense, the most ancient cosmogonies that we have, and it's difficult to sort all of these out. James Allen, an Egyptologist, has done a marvelous job with attempting to do this. But as you try and look at this, you find that the first notion is Atum is going to create the Aeneid, the nine.
Hmm.
So there's going to be him and then four pairs, male female pairs that
Yeah.
he creates. And what Ptah is doing in the Memphite theology is the same kind of thing, only he is replacing Atum as the first cause and moving forward. And
Mm.
so he creates his own Aeneid,
Mm.
which I think is rather intriguing and interesting. And I
Hmm.
believe with the 19th dynasty and its emphasis on Memphis as its capital and this kind of thing, that this may have been an attempt to undermine the southern Theban power base from a religious
Hmm.
standpoint and
Hmm.
accounts for what is maybe happening
Yeah.
in the account. But that doesn't deny at all the similarities that you pointed out
Right.
earlier. And I think it does point to a familiarity on the part of the writer.
I want to pick up on that point. You've said it now a couple times, the familiarity of the author.
Yes.
And I'm curious about the familiarity of his audience. Let me
Yes.
put it this way. Let me give an example.
Okay.
I love telling my students about this all the time. So I'm here in Israel, and I teach Israelis.
Mm.
And if I were to be giving a lecture, and I were to throw out the term "the bombs bursting in air," they would look at me with a blank stare. I've done this also with mixed groups of English speakers,
Uh,
Americans and British. And the
yes.
British stare at me and have no idea what I'm talking about. And the Americans are all smiling. And that's obviously because every American knows exactly what I'm talking about because that's from our national anthem. And
Right.
I would, just like I don't know the I don't know the words of the British national anthem, they don't know the words of the American national anthem. Which is to say, whenever a speaker or a
Mhm.
writer invokes a term, they
Yes.
only do so, or an image, they only do so if they have confidence that their audience is going to get it. And
Yes.
so when we see these similarities, the
Hmm.
utterances and the satisfaction at the end of the creation, Yes. And so the question really becomes, is this just the author and, he was grinning because he knows where this is from and maybe one day Berman and Younger will be able to talk about it too? Or, as I suspect, he is speaking this way because his audience is going to get it also.
Yes. Yes, I would concur. I think we need to consider not only what the author is doing, but also the readership. Who is the readership?
Okay, and, which then maybe suggests that the audience for this type of writing also has this familiarity, which perhaps is most easily garnered by being there in Egypt.
I think so. We really don't have any evidence, so far as I know, of knowledge of the Memphite theology outside of Egypt. So that would argue that both the writer and his intended audience is familiar enough with it to get the illusion.
Terrific. Well, to conclude, Lawson, you've had a long career. You've been doing this all for a very long time. The areas that you've done, I think, the most work are about Phoenicians and Arameans. I got to ask you, what excites you about Phoenicians and Arameans?
Well, the Arameans are the one that excite me the most. And the part of the reason for that is they keep me in all the areas I'd really like to stay in. So to really study the Arameans.
What period are we talking about when we speak about
We're talking
Arameans?
about the beginning of the first millennium. Let's just say the Iron Age. Okay. So Iron 1, Iron 2, and that's really my concentration. So about 1200 to, let's just say 500 for quick computation here. But to really study them, you have to work in Assyriological things, both Middle Assyrian, Neo-Assyrian. You have to work in Hebrew Bible. You have to, of course, work in Aramaic inscriptions, because a number of the Aramean polities, especially in North Syria, were mixed populations. The Luvians are another group, and that's another language and people that fascinate me. I think as we continue on in the future, that's going to become more and more an interesting point of study for the divided monarchy period of Israel. So all of those things tie me in. The Phoenicians interest me because I'm interested in bilinguals. And the Phoenicians, there are a number of very intriguing and interesting bilinguals. And so that's what ties me in.
Okay.
So, it's a fascinating world, and I wish I had more time, but if I had more time, I might stretch myself into other areas.
Okay.
So, fortunately, I have a wife that helps keep me steady and straight.
Okay. Well, Lawson, we, on behalf of all my listeners, we wish you many more years of health and productivity to pursue all of these wonderful pursuits. Lawson Younger, thank you so much for being my inaugural guest on the Bible Bar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me at the Bible Bar. If sustained, serious engagement with the Bible is something you're drawn to, you may want to explore graduate study in Bible through our international program at Bar-Ilan University. The program is designed for students from around the world, with options that allow you to combine periods of study in Israel with learning from abroad. You can find more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and until next time, Shalom.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.